On November 10th, 1975, at 7:10 in the evening, the United States Coast Guard received a radio transmission from the ORA freighter Arthur M. Anderson. The message was urgent and chilling. "Anderson to Coast Guard, we have lost contact with the Edmund Fitzgerald. She was right behind us, and now she's gone from our radar." The Edmund Fitzgerald, a 729-foot Great Lakes freighter carrying 26,000 tons of iron ore, had vanished from the surface of Lake Superior. 29 men were aboard. Not a single distress call was sent. No mayday, no emergency signal. The ship simply disappeared. Within 20 minutes of her last radio contact, the Edmund Fitzgerald had broken in half and plunged to the bottom of the lake in 530 feet of water. It would become the most famous shipwreck in Great Lakes history, and nearly 50 years later, we still don't know exactly what happened in those final moments. Before we dive into this story, if you appreciate deep dive documentaries like this one that honor the people involved and explore what really happened, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing you these in-depth investigations into maritime history. Now, let's go back to where this story really begins. The Edmund Fitzgerald wasn't just another cargo ship on the Great Lakes. When she was launched on June 7, 1958, at the Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge, Michigan, she was the largest ship ever built on the Great Lakes, stretching 729 feet from bow to stern. Her sheer size was staggering, longer than 2 football fields, with a cargo capacity that dwarfed most freighters of her era. She was named after Edmund Fitzgerald, the president and chairman of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, which owned the vessel. At her christening, the press called her unsinkable, a word that would later carry haunting irony. Though Fitzgerald quickly became a legend on the lakes. For 17 years, she hauled iron ore across the Great Lakes without a single major incident, becoming a symbol of American industrial might during the height of the steel industry. Each trip carried thousands of tons of taconite pellets, the raw material that fed the blast furnaces of Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago. Without ships like the Fitzgerald, the steel mills would have ground to a halt, and the auto industry, the beating heart of mid-century America, would have stalled. She was more than a ship. She was a lifeline for the nation's industrial economy. But she had one troubling characteristic. Sailors called her a loose ship, meaning she flexed and twisted in heavy seas. This was intentional. Great Lakes freighters were built with less rigid frames than ocean-going vessels to withstand freshwater wave patterns. Yet after years of constant use, this flexibility weakened her hull. By 1975, the Fitzgerald had developed what the crew called the wiggle. In rough seas, you could stand midship and watch the bow and stern move independently, almost like 2 separate pieces joined by a hinge. Some crew members even reported seeing deck plates ripple during storms. To outsiders, this might sound alarming, but to seasoned sailors, it was simply part of life aboard the Fitzgerald. Still, it planted seeds of doubt that would later grow into haunting questions. Now, about the 29 men aboard her final voyage. Captain Ernest McSorley, 63, had sailed the Great Lakes for 44 years. This was to be his last season before retirement. Known as a cautious captain who respected the lake's power, he avoided unnecessary risks. His first mate, John McCarthy, was 62 and also nearing retirement. Together, they had more than 80 years of experience on these waters. Their leadership gave the crew confidence, even as the November storms loomed. The crew ranged in age from 20 to 63. Michael Armagust, just 20, was the third. Mate. Days before, he had written to his family saying he loved his job and couldn't wait to be home for the holidays. Chief Engineer George Hall had long sailed with McSorley and trusted him completely. Bruce Hudson, a deckhand, was newly engaged in planning a spring wedding. Others included quiet veterans who had spent decades on the lakes, and younger men eager to prove themselves in one of the toughest maritime environments in the world. These weren't just names on a manifest. They were fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, and friends. Each had his own story, his own dreams, and his own reasons for braving the cold waters of Lake Superior. Life aboard the Fitzgerald was demanding, but carried a sense of pride. The crew worked long shifts in freezing temperatures, often battling ice buildup on the decks and machinery. Meals were hearty, laughter was common in the mess hall, and camaraderie was strong. For many, the Fitzgerald wasn't just a workplace, it was a second home. The men trusted their captain, trusted their ship, and trusted each other. That bond would be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. On the morning of November 9th, 1975, The Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin, bound for Detroit, Michigan, carrying a full load of taconite iron ore pellets. The forecast warned of gale force winds, but nothing beyond what an experienced crew and a sturdy ship could handle. McSorley had faced worse. Another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, captained by Jesse Cooper, left Superior that same morning on a similar course. The two captains stayed in radio contact, and Cooper would later be the last person to speak with McSorley before the Fitzgerald went down. Neither man knew they were sailing straight into one of the most violent storms in Great Lakes history, a storm that, combined with structural weaknesses and catastrophic failures, would create the perfect conditions for disaster. If you're finding this investigation compelling, please hit the like button and share this video with anyone interested in maritime history. These stories need to be remembered, and your engagement helps ensure they reach people who appreciate detailed, respectful documentaries like this one. Now, let's talk about the storm that was developing over Lake Superior. The storm that hit Lake Superior on November 10th, 1975, was what meteorologists call a November gale, but that term doesn't capture the sheer violence of what was developing over the lake. The National Weather Service had issued gale warnings, which meant sustained winds of 34 to 47 knots with waves 10 to 15 feet high. But the actual conditions would far exceed those predictions. Two low-pressure systems were converging over the lake, one moving in from the Canadian prairies and another pushing up from the American Midwest. When these systems collided over the cold waters of Lake Superior, they created something meteorologists would later describe as a meteorological bomb. Wind speeds would reach hurricane force, gusting over 70 miles per hour, and waves would build to heights of 35 feet or more. But there was another factor that made these waves particularly dangerous. Lake Superior, unlike the ocean, is a confined body of water. When storm winds blow across it, the waves don't have the long, rolling pattern of ocean swells. Instead, they're steep, close together, and chaotic. Sailors call them Three Sisters, a pattern where three massive waves hit in rapid succession, each one larger than the last, with almost no recovery time between them. To a ship already weakened or listing, the Three Sisters could be fatal. Mariners on the Great Lakes had told stories of these waves for generations, often with a mix of awe and dread. Some ships had survived them, but many had not. On the morning of November 10th, as the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Arthur M. Anderson made their way across Lake Superior, both captains were monitoring the weather closely. Captain McSorley chose a route closer to the Canadian shore, seeking the shelter of the coastline to reduce the impact of the building northwest winds. At 1 a.m., the Weather Service upgraded their warning from gale warning to storm warning, indicating winds of 48 to 63 knots. Captain McSorley acknowledged the warning and told Captain Cooper over the radio that he planned to tuck in close to the Canadian shore for protection. It was a decision rooted in experience. Hugging the shoreline often gave ships a fighting chance against the worst of the open lake's fury. By early afternoon, both ships were making their way through increasingly heavy seas. The winds had shifted to the northeast and were now blowing directly down the length of the lake, creating the worst possible conditions. Waves were building to 25 feet, and both ships were taking water over their decks with every wave that hit. On the Fitzgerald, the crew worked frantically to keep the ship steady, but the strain was becoming obvious. At 1 p.m., Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson with concerning news. The Fitzgerald's fence rail, a protective railing that ran along the deck, had been torn away by the waves. Additionally, he reported that the ship had lost both of its ballast tank pumps, which meant they couldn't pump out any water that was getting into the cargo hold. Captain Cooper asked if the Fitzgerald was taking on water. McSorley's response was measured but concerning. He said they had taken some water aboard and had a list, meaning the ship was leaning to one side, but that they were plugging along. This was the first indication that something was seriously wrong. The loss of both ballast pumps meant that if the ship was taking on water, whether through hatch covers, through the damaged fence rail area, or through any hull breaches, they had no way to pump it out. The water would accumulate in the cargo hold, making the ship heavier and sitting lower in the water with each passing hour. For a ship already known to flex under stress, this was a dangerous situation. At 3:30 p.m., Captain McSorley made another radio call to the Anderson. He reported that he had a bad list and that the ship was rolling heavy. He asked Captain Cooper to stay close and keep track of them on radar because visibility was deteriorating rapidly in the blowing snow and spray. The weather continued to worsen. By 4 p.m., the winds were sustained at 50 knots with gusts over 70 miles per hour. The waves had built to an estimated 30 to 35 feet, and both ships were being battered relentlessly. On the Anderson, crew members would later report that the ship was corkscrewing through the waves, twisting and plunging in ways they'd never experienced before in their years on the lakes. But the Edmund Fitzgerald, now sitting lower in the water due to accumulated flooding and carrying a heavy list to one side, was in far worse condition. The ship that had been called unsinkable 17 years earlier was now struggling to stay afloat in the worst storm Lake Superior had seen in decades. At approximately 5:45 p.m., the Anderson passed Michippicoten Island on the Canadian shore. Captain Cooper looked back through the blowing snow and could still see the Fitzgerald's lights about 10 to 15 miles behind them. The two ships were now approaching Whitefish Bay, where they would have shelter from the storm. They were almost there. Safety was less than 20 miles away, but the Edmund Fitzgerald would never reach Whitefish Bay at 7:10 p.m. On November 10, 1975, First Mate Morgan Clark of the Arthur M. Anderson made a routine radio call to the Edmund Fitzgerald. Both ships were now entering the approach to Whitefish Bay, and Clark wanted to confirm their positions and coordinate their entry into the protected waters. Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. I have a sea gate warning from the Coast Guard. Over. Captain McSorley responded, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. Roger that, Anderson. Clark then asked the question that would become etched in Great Lakes maritime history. Fitzgerald, how are you making out with your problems? There was a brief pause, and then Captain McSorley's final words, we are holding our own. Those were the last words anyone would ever hear from Captain Ernest McSorley or anyone aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. At approximately 7:15 p.m., just minutes after that final transmission, First Mate Clark was watching the Fitzgerald on the Anderson's radar screen. The blip that represented the Fitzgerald was clear and strong, about 10 miles ahead of them. He turned away from the radar to attend to something else on the bridge. When he looked back less than 10 minutes later, the Fitzgerald's blip was gone. Clark assumed there was a problem with the radar. Ships don't just disappear. He tried adjusting the radar settings, changing the range, switching between different display modes. Nothing. The Fitzgerald was simply not there. He immediately called Captain Cooper to the bridge. Cooper grabbed the radio and tried to raise the Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. Do you read me? Over. Silence. Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. Please respond. Over. Nothing but the howl of the wind and the crash of waves. Captain Cooper tried different radio channels. He called repeatedly for 10 minutes, each time with increasing urgency. There was no response. At 7:39 p.m., Cooper called the Coast Guard and reported that the Edmund Fitzgerald was missing. The Coast Guard initially didn't understand what Cooper was reporting. Ships don't vanish in minutes. They asked if the Fitzgerald might have just lost radio contact. Cooper's response was firm and frightening. No, she's gone from our radar. I'm telling you, she's gone. At that moment, somewhere in the dark, violent waters between Michippicoten Island and Whitefish Bay, the Edmund Fitzgerald, all 729 feet and 13,000 tons of her, had broken apart and sunk to the bottom of Lake Superior in less than 20 minutes from her last radio contact. 29 men had died, most of them likely never knowing what was happening until the water rushed in. What exactly happened in those final moments? That question would haunt investigators, maritime experts, and the families of the crew for decades. The storm raged through the night of November 10th and into the morning of November 11th. Coast Guard and civilian vessels began searching at first light, but the conditions were still extremely dangerous. What they found was heartbreaking and perplexing. Debris began washing up along the Canadian shoreline. Life jackets, life rings, pieces of wood, fragments of a lifeboat, and personal items belonging to the crew. But there were no survivors, no bodies, and initially, no sign of the ship itself. It was as if the Edmund Fitzgerald had been completely swallowed by the lake. The search continued for days. On November 14th, a Navy aircraft using underwater detection equipment located what they believed to be the wreck in 530 feet of water, about 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. But the depth and the continuing rough weather made any immediate investigation impossible. It wasn't until May of 1976, 6 months after the sinking, that a U.S. Navy underwater recovery vehicle was able to dive to the wreck and document what remained of the Edmund Fitzgerald. What they found shocked even experienced salvage experts. The Edmund Fitzgerald had broken completely in half. The bow section was relatively intact, sitting upright on the lake bottom, but the stern section was upside down and severely damaged, lying about 170 feet from the bow. The ship had clearly suffered catastrophic structural failure. breaking apart either on the surface or during its plunge to the bottom. The question that would dominate all subsequent investigations was simple but crucial. What caused the ship to break apart? Within days of the sinking, the U.S. Coast Guard launched a formal investigation into the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Marine Board of Investigation, as it was called, would hear testimony from maritime experts, weather specialists, ship designers, and most importantly, from Captain Jesse Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson, the last person to have contact with Captain McSorley. The investigation faced immediate challenges. There were no survivors to interview, no black box or voyage data recorder to analyze, no witnesses to the actual sinking except the crew of the Anderson, who had only seen the Fitzgerald on radar and had heard her final radio transmission. The wreck itself lay in water too deep for divers to reach safely, at least with the technology available in 1976. But the investigators had several pieces of crucial evidence. They had the weather data from that day, which showed storm conditions far worse than initially forecast. They had Captain Cooper's testimony about the Fitzgerald's reported damage and list. They had the debris field and the pattern of how pieces of the ship had scattered. And eventually, they would have underwater photography and video of the wreck itself. The initial underwater survey in May of 1976 revealed disturbing details. The bow section of the ship was driven into the lake bottom with such force that it had buried itself several feet into the mud. This indicated that the bow had plunged to the bottom nearly vertically, falling like a spear from the surface. The stern section, lying upside down and heavily damaged, told a different story. It appeared to have broken off from the bow and then tumbled during its descent, explaining why it was inverted and why the superstructure was so heavily damaged. But the most significant finding was this: the ship's cargo hatches, the massive steel covers that protected the cargo hold from water, were still closed and intact. This was crucial because one of the early theories about the sinking suggested that the hatches had failed and allowed water to flood the cargo hold. The underwater footage showed this theory was unlikely. However, investigators did notice something concerning about the hatches. They were closed, but they showed signs of damage and deformation, particularly on the starboard side. Some hatches appeared to have been forced downward, possibly by massive waves striking the deck. The investigation also examined the ship's maintenance records. The Edmund Fitzgerald had undergone regular inspections and had passed her annual Coast Guard inspection just earlier that year. But there were notes in the maintenance logs about minor repairs needed to some of the hatch cover clamps and gaskets, repairs that had been scheduled for the winter layup period when the ship would be out of service. Were these minor maintenance issues enough to contribute to the sinking? The investigators couldn't be certain. Another piece of evidence came from analyzing the storm itself. Meteorologists who studied the weather data concluded that the waves on Lake Superior that night had likely reached 35 feet or higher, with some individual waves possibly exceeding 40 feet. In the shallow waters near Caribou Island, where the Fitzgerald had passed earlier in the day, waves could have been even steeper due to the lake bottom forcing wave energy upward. This led to one of the most debated aspects of the investigation. Had the Edmund Fitzgerald struck bottom on 6 Fathom Shoal near Caribou Island? Captain Cooper believed this was possible. He testified that based on the Fitzgerald's radar position earlier in the day, she had passed very close to this shallow area, possibly within a mile or less. If the ship, already sitting lower in the water due to flooding, had been lifted by a massive wave and then dropped onto the rocky bottom of 6 Fathom Shoal, it could have suffered catastrophic hull damage that went undetected until the situation became critical hours later. However, the Coast Guard's official investigation dismissed this theory. They calculated that even with the flooding Captain McSorley reported, the ship's draft would not have been deep enough to strike bottom in that area, even allowing for wave action. But Captain Cooper maintained his position for the rest of his life. He believed the Fitzgerald had been damaged by grounding, and that this damage, combined with the continued flooding and the massive waves, had eventually overwhelmed the ship. The Coast Guard's final report, issued in July of 1977, concluded that the most likely cause of the sinking was massive flooding of the cargo hold due to ineffective hatch closures. They theorized that water had entered through damaged or improperly secured hatch covers, gradually flooding the cargo hold until the ship's bow plunged underwater, and the forces of the storm broke her in half. But this conclusion was immediately controversial and would remain so for decades. Theory 1: the hatch cover failure. This was the Coast Guard's official position. Investigators argued that the ship's hatch covers, particularly on the forward section of the vessel, had failed due to a combination of age, maintenance issues, and the relentless pounding of massive waves. Water gradually flooded into the cargo hold, making the ship heavier and sitting lower in the water until eventually the bow plunged under and the stress broke the ship in two. Supporting this theory was the nature of the cargo itself. Taconite ore, when mixed with water, becomes extremely heavy and can shift unpredictably, creating instability inside the hold. The Coast Guard pointed to maintenance records showing that some hatch cover gaskets and clamps needed repair, and they argued that even minor deficiencies could have allowed water to seep in. During the storm, once water began entering the cargo hold, the process would have been self-reinforcing. The ship would sit lower, take on more water, and become increasingly unstable until structural failure was inevitable. However, critics of this theory raised serious objections. Underwater footage taken in 1976 showed the hatches were closed and intact, with no obvious signs of catastrophic failure. If the hatches had failed so badly that they let in enough water to sink the ship, the evidence should have been unmistakable. Maritime unions argued that blaming the hatch covers was a convenient way for the Coast Guard to shift responsibility onto the crew and the shipping company, rather than acknowledging deeper structural or regulatory issues. Some naval architects also noted that hatch covers on Great Lakes freighters were designed to withstand enormous pressure, and while minor leaks were possible, a complete failure across multiple hatches seemed unlikely. They argued that the Coast Guard's conclusion relied too heavily on assumptions about maintenance lapses and not enough on physical evidence. Families of the crew were particularly angered by this theory, feeling that it implied negligence on the part of the men who had died, men who had reputations for professionalism and caution. The hatch cover theory remained the official government position, but it was far from universally accepted. For many, it was seen as an oversimplification of a complex disaster, a way to provide closure without truly answering the haunting question: why did the Edmund Fitzgerald break apart so suddenly and without warning? Theory 2. The shoaling damage captain. Jesse Cooper's theory held that the Edmund Fitzgerald had struck bottom on 6 Fathom Shoal near Caribou Island, suffering hull damage that allowed water to flood in. This damage, combined with the loss of the ballast pumps and the continuing storm, gradually overwhelmed the ship. Supporting this theory was the Fitzgerald's radar position that afternoon, which showed she had passed extremely close to the shoal area. 6 Fathom Shoal was notorious among Great Lakes sailors. Charts marked it clearly, but in heavy seas and poor visibility, even experienced captains could misjudge their position. The shoal was a hidden menace, a rocky rise beneath the surface where waves broke violently, creating chaotic conditions. Cooper noted that the shoal was infamous for producing steep, breaking waves that could hammer a ship's hull with tremendous force. If the Fitzgerald had been lifted by a massive wave and then dropped onto the rocky bottom, even briefly, the impact could have torn open seams in the hull or dislodged hull plates. This damage might not have been immediately catastrophic, but would have allowed flooding that slowly worsened as the storm continued. The shoaling theory had strong appeal because it explained several puzzling details. McSorley's reports of a bad list and heavy rolling could have been the result of uneven flooding caused by hull damage. The loss of the ballast pumps meant the crew had no way to counteract the water entering the ship. And the fact that the Fitzgerald sank so suddenly suggested that she had been weakened long before her final plunge. The main argument against this theory was the Coast Guard's calculation that the ship's draft wasn't deep enough to strike bottom, even accounting for wave action. According to their analysis, the Fitzgerald had enough clearance to pass safely over the shoal, but these calculations relied on assumptions about how much water the ship had already taken on and how low she was sitting in the water, assumptions that couldn't be verified with certainty. Critics argued that in the chaos of the storm, with waves lifting and dropping the ship unpredictably, even a brief grounding could have been enough to cause fatal damage. Captain Cooper remained convinced for the rest of his life that the Fitzgerald had struck bottom. His testimony carried weight because he was the last captain to speak with McSorley and had tracked the Fitzgerald's position closely. Many sailors agreed with him, noting that shoaling accidents were not uncommon on the Great Lakes, especially in storm conditions. For them, the shoaling theory was not just plausible. It was the most logical explanation for how a ship as large and experienced as the Fitzgerald could vanish so quickly. Theory 3. The Three Sisters wave pattern. Some experts believe the Fitzgerald was struck by a series of massive waves known as Three Sisters, a pattern where 3 enormous waves hit in rapid succession, each one larger than the last. This phenomenon is well documented on the Great Lakes and is particularly dangerous because ships don't have time to recover between waves. Unlike ocean swells, which are long and rolling, Great Lakes waves are steep, close together, and chaotic. When Three Sisters strike, the first wave can overwhelm a ship's bow, the second can hold it down, and the third can deliver a fatal blow. If the Fitzgerald, already damaged in listing, had been struck by such a wave pattern, the first wave could have driven the bow underwater, The second wave could have pinned it down, and the third wave could have broken the ship's back, snapping her in two. This theory explained why the ship sank so quickly and why there was no distress call. If the bow had been driven under in seconds and the ship had broken apart moments later, there would have been no time to radio for help. The crew would have been overwhelmed before they could react. Supporters of this theory pointed to eyewitness accounts from sailors on other ships who had experienced three sisters firsthand. They described the waves as towering walls of water that seemed to appear out of nowhere, often during the most violent storms. On the night of November 10th, conditions were perfect for such a phenomenon. Hurricane-force winds blowing the length of Lake Superior, shallow waters near Caribou Island amplifying wave energy, and a ship already weakened by flooding and structural stress. However, critics noted that this theory didn't explain the earlier flooding that Captain McSorley had reported, the damaged fence rail, or the list the ship had been carrying for hours before she sank. The three sisters could account for the suddenness of the disaster, but not the gradual deterioration that preceded it. Some experts argued that while the waves may have delivered the final blow, they were not the root cause of the sinking. Still, the Three Sisters theory remains one of the most haunting possibilities. It captures the raw, unpredictable power of Lake Superior, a force that can overwhelm even the largest ships in seconds. For many, it symbolizes the terrifying reality that in the Great Lakes, nature can unleash a sequence of events so sudden and violent that no amount of experience or preparation can save a crew. Theory 4. Structural failure due to fatigue. A fourth theory, advanced by some naval architects, suggested that the Fitzgerald's hull had been weakened by 17 years of stress, particularly the flexing motion that had given her the reputation of being a loose ship. This accumulated fatigue, combined with the extreme forces of the storm, caused the hull to break apart. Supporting this theory was evidence that Great Lakes freighters of that era were not built to the same structural standards as ocean-going vessels. The lakes were considered protected waters, and ships were designed to be lighter and carry more cargo relative to their size. This design philosophy allowed them to maximize efficiency but made them more vulnerable to catastrophic failure under extreme conditions. Naval engineers noted that while ocean freighters had to withstand the long, rolling swells of the Atlantic or Pacific, Great Lakes ships were subjected to short, steep waves that created different stresses. Over time, this repeated flexing could weaken welds, rivets, and steel plates. Later analysis of photos taken of the Fitzgerald in her final years showed visible stress fractures in some areas of the hull, particularly near the number 1 hatch. These fractures, while not immediately dangerous under normal conditions, could have propagated rapidly under the extreme stress of the storm. If the hull was already compromised, the massive waves of November 10th could have pushed the ship past its breaking point. Critics of this theory argued that structural fatigue alone didn't explain the flooding and list that McSorley reported hours before the ship sank. Structural failure from fatigue would likely have been sudden and catastrophic, not a gradual deterioration. If the hull had simply snapped, the ship would have gone down without warning, leaving no time for McSorley to report earlier problems. Still, the fatigue theory resonated with many experts because it highlighted a broader issue: the design standards of Great Lakes freighters. The Fitzgerald was not the only ship to suffer structural problems. Other vessels of her era, such as the Carl D. Bradley and the Daniel J. Morrell, had also broken apart in storms, raising questions about whether the industry had underestimated the destructive power of the lakes. For some, the Fitzgerald's loss was not just a tragic accident, but part of a pattern, a warning that the Great Lakes demanded ships as strong as those built for the oceans. Most experts today believe the answer isn't a single cause, but a combination of factors. The most likely scenario goes something like this. The Edmund Fitzgerald passed dangerously close to 6 Fathom Shoal, possibly suffering bottom damage that created small leaks in the hull. This damage, combined with water coming over the deck through the damaged fence rail area and possibly through compromised hatch gaskets, began flooding the forward cargo holds. With both ballast pumps out of commission, the crew had no way to pump out this accumulating water. As the ship took on more water, she sat lower and lower in the seas, making her more vulnerable to wave action. The list to one side indicated uneven flooding, possibly meaning one side of the cargo hold was filling faster than the other. This made the ship unstable and even more difficult to handle. Finally, as the ship approached Whitefish Bay, she was struck by a series of massive waves, possibly a Three Sisters pattern. The bow, already heavy with water, plunged under. The forces on the ship's structure, already weakened by years of flexing and possibly by bottom damage, exceeded what the hull could withstand. The ship broke in two, with the bow section diving straight down and the stern section flipping and tumbling as it sank. From the moment the bow went under to the moment the stern disappeared beneath the waves, less than a minute passed. The crew had no time to radio for help, no time to launch lifeboats, possibly no time to even understand what was happening. All 29 men died, most likely from drowning as the water rushed in, though some may have been killed instantly by the violence of the ship breaking apart. The loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald remains the worst disaster in Great Lakes shipping history. 29 men perished, leaving behind wives, children, parents, and siblings who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what those final moments were like. The investigation and the various theories brought little comfort to the families. What they wanted was simple and impossible: to know exactly what happened and why their loved ones died. The lake, as the saying goes, never gives up her dead, and indeed, no bodies were ever recovered from the wreck. In 1995, 20 years after the sinking, the ship's bronze bell was recovered from the wreck site and replaced with a replica bell engraved, with the names of the 29 crew members. The original bell is now housed at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point, where it is rung 29 times each November 10th in memorial. The sound of the bell carries across the cold November air, each toll a solemn reminder of a life cut short. For the families, the bell became a symbol of closure, a tangible connection to the men who never came home. The sinking led to significant changes in Great Lakes shipping regulations. Ships were required to have better weather monitoring equipment, improved hatch cover designs, and more rigorous inspection protocols. The loading practices were also revised to ensure that ships weren't carrying cargo that made them too low in the water during storm season. These reforms were born of tragedy, but they have saved countless lives in the decades since. The Fitzgerald's loss reshaped maritime safety on the Great Lakes, ensuring that her story would not be forgotten in policy as well as memory. But perhaps the most lasting impact was cultural. In 1976, Canadian folk singer Gordon Lightfoot released his song "The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald," which brought the tragedy to international attention and ensured that the story would never be forgotten. The song, with its haunting melody and respectful lyrics, became a tribute to the crew and a reminder of the power of nature. For many listeners, Lightfoot's ballad was their first introduction to the story, and it transformed the Fitzgerald from a regional tragedy into a global symbol of human vulnerability against the forces of nature. Even today, the song is played on radio stations every November, keeping alive the memory of the men who sailed into history. The wreck site itself is now protected as a maritime gravesite. Diving is prohibited, and any salvage operations require special permission. The site is marked on maritime charts as a hazard to navigation, a somber reminder of what lies below. Every year on November 10th, memorial services are held at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum and at maritime museums across the Great Lakes region. Family members, survivors of other Great Lakes shipwrecks, and those who simply want to honor the memory of the crew gather to remember the 29 men who sailed out of Superior on November 9th and never came home. The Edmund Fitzgerald reminds us that despite all our technology, all our engineering, and all our experience, nature still has the power to humble us. Lake Superior, beautiful and serene in summer, transforms into something deadly when November storms arrive. The men who sail these waters understand this, respect it, and yet continue to do their jobs, because the cargo must move and the economy depends on them. We remember Ernest McSorley, who was weeks away from retirement. We remember Michael Armagast, just 20 years old, with his whole life ahead of him. We remember Bruce Hudson, who was planning his wedding. We remember all 29 men who served aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald, and we honor their memory by never forgetting what happened on that November night in 1975. Lake Superior never gave up her dead, but she could not silence their story. The Fitzgerald's legacy also lives on in education and preservation. Maritime academies across the Great Lakes use her story as a case study in safety, engineering, and seamanship. Museums display artifacts, photographs, and oral histories, ensuring that new generations understand the risks faced by those who worked the lakes. For the families, the tragedy is deeply personal, but for the broader public, it has become a lesson in humility, resilience, and remembrance. Ultimately, the Edmund Fitzgerald story is one of tragedy, but also of endurance. The men who sailed her are remembered not only for how they died, but for how they lived, with courage, skill, and dedication to their work. Their story continues to echo across the waters of Lake Superior, carried in song, memorial, and the tolling of a bronze bell. The Edmund Fitzgerald story is one of tragedy, but also of remembrance. May the 29 men rest in peace, and may we never forget. Thank you for watching this in-depth look at the Edmund Fitzgerald disaster. If you found this documentary informative and respectful to the memory of the crew, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We produce detailed maritime history documentaries that honor the people involved while exploring the fascinating technical and human elements of these events. Consider sharing this with others who appreciate Great Lakes history or maritime disasters. These stories deserve to be told and remembered. If you'd like to see more documentaries like this, check out our playlist on Great Lakes shipping history.